have you had to from time to time hire private investigators to help you, particularly to find out if somebody's not disclosing some significant stuff?
I over the years I've not used private investigators very often. I have a few times. Most often I've seen them used in child custody cases where there may be allegations that someone's violating a court order. For example, if there's an order that says a parent is not permitted to use alcoholic beverages while they have custody or visitation with a child, and you suspect they are. I've seen people use private investigators to maybe follow the person to a restaurant with the children and get them on videotape violating a court. Yeah, so I've seen that. In terms of assets, sure, I think sometimes investigators are used, but there are a lot of ways. First, you give people every chance. Even if you know they're hiding something, you give them every chance to disclose it the way they're supposed to first.
Okay. So why don't we talk about some issues related to the family residence?
Okay.
So.
Sure. Family residence is an asset that over the years has created a lot of litigation. People during their marriage often engage in transactions with real property where they don't really think about the consequences. For example, very common that one spouse owned a house or had money that was used to later buy a house during the marriage, and that prior house or the other asset was their separate property.
Right.
And then during the marriage, they acquire a new residence and they use their separate property money to acquire the new residence, but they title it in both parties' names as community property. It raises an issue now. Is the separate property contributor entitled to any reimbursement or any part of the net value of that residence at the time of dissolution? The answer is yes, but a lot of other things can happen, and now we see with all the refinancing people have done over the years, it creates issues. Another of their common experiences: somebody owns a house before marriage, it's titled in their name, it's their separate property. A few years after marriage, he or she refinances their residence, and normally as a consequence of the refinance, both spouses now end up on title, and the party who had separate property often didn't intend to make a gift, but the law is they've just made a gift to the community, the net result of which is the community would be entitled to all the appreciation in value from that point forward. We have a lot of issues of title changes that occurred during the marriage where one spouse claims that they were wronged by the other spouse, either by being taken off title or the other spouse going on to title when they previously weren't there. And in California, the law is that there is a presumption of undue influence when a spouse gains an advantage in a transaction, an interspousal transaction during the marriage. So for example, you own your house as your separate property, your spouse comes to you and convinces you to put them on title for some reason, the dissolution occurs later, there may be a claim by you that, or certainly she was advantaged by the transaction, and she has to prove that the change in title was not a product of undue influence. So those are some of the issues that come up. Of course, there can be disputes about value and who's awarded the house, or do you sell it?
Yeah.
One of the frustrating issues as attorneys that we run into is when you have a property and there's a recognition that it needs to be sold, people can't agree on who's the real estate broker going to be, what's the listing price, are we going to paint it, does somebody's aunt get to list the property, who's going to live in the property, are they going to pay rent to the community while they live in the property? Any dispute you could imagine that could occur, does occur, sometimes even after there's an agreement to sell the family residence.
And in some of these things, I guess you were talking about, these contributions maybe before you were married and so forth. So you may actually have to get an accountant involved to sort of figure it and do all this tracing to figure out, okay, well, who's entitled to what, I guess.
Absolutely. If it's a single transaction, it could be relatively simple, but when you have a series of refinances over the years where sometimes people are taking cash out or they're using part of it for improvements to the property, it can get very complicated, and in those cases we do use forensic accountants. I would say fairly high percentage of my practice, we use a forensic accountant for at least some analysis in the case. And often if we go to trial or hearings, accountants come in and testify as expert witnesses.
Right. And your client may have had no idea it was going to be this involved when they started this whole process.
They often don't, or people sometimes separate and don't do anything,
Yeah.
and then they find out they are accruing rights and obligations during their period of separation, even though nobody's filed anything.
Yeah.
And as far as the family residence, an example that people often don't know about is the question of fair rental value. So say one spouse moves out of the house, leaves the other one there, the dissolution starts 2 years later, well, the out spouse may say, you owe me rent, or you owe the community rent. You've been in the house for 2 years, there's no mortgage on it, I rented a house down the street, it cost me $3,000 a month, you should be paying me half of that rental value that you owe to the community because you've had exclusive use of the house.
Oh boy. Okay. Are there any differences in how community property is treated for divorce as compared to like a death situation?
Yes, well, one of them, I talked about the reimbursement claims. That's Family
Yeah.
Code Section 2640, is the Family Code section that talks about reimbursement for someone who contributes separate property toward the acquisition of community property. Most commonly, I'd say it comes up in the area of the family residence, which at least until the last few years has normally been an appreciating asset, particularly here in California. We've seen lots of appreciation up until the last couple of years. 2640 applies in a dissolution of marriage, but it does not apply in a death situation. So that's one example where there is a difference.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, how is mediation used as an alternative to a court proceeding in a divorce situation?
Okay. Mediation is much more common than when I started practicing 31 years ago. So what we're talking about is using a neutral person, normally an attorney, who acts in the capacity of someone who tries to facilitate an agreement. And the way it's practiced here, normally that attorney will do the actual drafting of agreements, and many attorneys will insist that both parties have an outside consulting attorney so they at least are getting legal advice because you don't want the neutral in a position where they're giving advice which...
conflict of interest.
Yeah, clearly there'd be a conflict of interest because they have an obligation of neutrality and impartiality toward both parties. So to get over that, most attorneys would insist or at least highly recommend that each party have their own attorney who may participate directly in the process or may just be on the side reviewing agreements as they're prepared and maybe helping them with their disclosure obligations. Mm-hmm. It's common. I always say to people, if you have a case that's going to be easy to mediate, it probably can be resolved without a mediator. It's not for everybody. I see a lot of people who've had failed mediations. One of the concerns about going into mediation is, I would say it's probably not for everybody. Certainly cases where there's unequal bargaining power, it's not a good idea. It's not uncommon where one spouse is holding all the cards. They understand the finances. They're the one that's managed the bank account. They may be the higher earner running a business, and they know about the retirement plan, and they understand income taxes. And the spouse who is not as knowledgeable and it doesn't have the information as readily available is probably at a disadvantage going into mediation. Also, cases where there's domestic violence or other issues of real conflict between the parties, probably not a good idea to go to mediation. I find the best cases for mediation are often ones where the parties are maybe equal in terms of education, work experience, and they've been separated for a significant period of time. where they've maybe gone through some of the emotion and anger that goes with the process, and they're more ready to treat it as a business transaction.
Mm-hmm. So that's sort of a special place to be. I mean, a situation. But you may be seeing a little bit more because, again, as you said, you've got both spouses working in many cases. And so you may have a little bit more of an equal situation where they can say, okay, well, we can go apart. But, you know, there are a lot of these cases. One of the spouses has been dependent on the other one, you know, the whole time they've been married, for taking care of the finances, knowing everything, and really sort of being the lead person maybe for major financial decisions. And now here, that person has to step into, I guess you have to say, a more aggressive role, you know, really of conflict. And it's a really tough place to be, I would think.
Some folks are not very good at it.
Yeah.
You could just ask them
well,
some
that's
questions.
why you hire an attorney. You know, so
that's exactly right.
You hire the attorney to be the bad guy for you. Well, we just have a couple of minutes left, Mark. Maybe you have a few thoughts to share related to this area of divorce basics, of things to fatherly advice, of things for people to think of when they're going through this process.
Well, I guess I would try and think of some things during the marriage before the process starts.
Okay.
Because you never know. A high percentage of marriages do end in divorce. Mm-hmm. The rest of them end in death. And there are consequences in the transactions you engage in during your marriage. When you buy or sell a house, you really ought to think about, what are you doing? Where's the money coming from? Am I using my separate property? Do I intend to give it up? Do I intend to make a gift? What source of money, if you have competing sources to buy a home or other significant assets? And you should talk about it with your spouse so you both know what you're doing. The reality is most people don't until the dissolution process starts, and then they think back and realize the mistakes they made that might cause them to lose what otherwise would have been their separate as opposed to community property. Or they may have just created more issues that makes the dissolution more time-consuming and more expensive.
Okay. I'll just make a real brief comment, and that is, you know, like for my wife and myself, I mean, we were married when we were 19. We had nothing, so everything was ours. But now, actually, we're getting to the place of having inheritance. And so suddenly this becomes more of an issue. And so to take the legal steps to define what's what and so forth, we've done that as far as that's the impetus for finally getting our trust done. Folks, I hope that you found this to be an interesting conversation. You know, again, we're just covering some basics. We hope that you're finding it thought-provoking. And Mark and I are going to have a couple of more discussions we hope you can follow, and we'll have these posted on our website, which is www.financialinsiderweekly.com under past episodes. And with that, we'll see you next time on Financial Insider Weekly.